Hi, I'm Miss Sarah. Today's project is going to be making parachutes. I don't know if you saw, but on Wednesday I posted a video about the Perseverance rover that was going to be parachuting down to the surface of Mars yesterday. It made me think about parachutes, and I thought it would be fun to do some parachute building. First, I'm just going to show you how to make them for fun. At the end, I'll talk a little bit about how to make it a little bit more mathy and sciencey for some of you older kids. This is something you could even do for a science fair project if it interests you. What you're going to need today is some string, and any old string will do, some tape, and again, you can use whatever kind of tape. Especially for you older kids, you might want to use a ruler, but you don't have to. You need some kind of a plastic bag. This is a kitchen garbage bag, but you could use a grocery bag from the store. You could use a big garbage bag, just any kind of plastic bag. This is what you're going to make your parachute from. You might want a marker. You're going to want something to parachute down. Now, I wish I had a rover, but I don't. I don't even have a plastic car. So I've got a little plastic toy soldier. I've got a baby dinosaur, and I've got a little person. So those will be my parachute test subjects. I'm going to need scissors to cut the plastic with, and I'm going to use a paper clip so I can switch my parachutes out for my different adventurers parachuting down. And then if you want to make your parachute round, you might want something to trace, and you might want to try different sizes. So I've got a couple different bowls here that I can trace to make a parachute. My first step is just going to be to make a big sheet of plastic out of my plastic bag. And what I'll do is I will cut down one side of the bag and then across the bottom, and that will give me a big sheet of plastic. If you're a little kid, you might get a grown-up to help you with the cutting. The cutting is usually pretty easy because with plastic you can usually just kind of slide the scissors along. So the only thing I need to be careful about in tracing this is to make sure I've got my plastic pretty flat underneath, and then I'm just going to trace around it. And now that it's traced, I'm going to cut it out. Now, cutting plastic is actually not super easy, but you know what? It doesn't matter if it's not exactly perfect. Parachutes can be any shape. I decided to make one that was a square. So to do that, I folded kind of a big triangle because I had straight edges from where I cut the edges of the bag off. I folded that in. I'm going to take my marker and mark along here and then cut it out, and I'll have quite a large square parachute. Your strings for your parachute can be any size. The only thing that's important is that all the strings on the parachute be the same length. I decided a good size might be about half the distance across the parachute. So I'm just going to take my string, stretch it from side to side, cut it off at the corner, cut it in half, there's 2 of my strings, and I'll do the same thing again to get 4 strings. Now I've got 4 strings that are all pretty much the same size. I've laid my 4 strings out so that there's one touching each corner, and I'll just put a little piece of tape attaching each string to each corner. Of course, my circle doesn't have corners, so I'm going to fold it in half and do a string here and a string here, and then I'll fold it the other way and do strings on the other sides. For all my parachutes, I'm just going to put all the ends together and tie a knot to hold all the strings together. So I'll do that with each of my parachutes. I made a bunch of parachutes that are different sizes and shapes. And there's something else I want to try. I'm wondering if a shopping bag could be a parachute all by itself. So now I've got my parachutes. I have to figure out how to attach my parachuters. I've got an idea for that too. For each of my harnesses for my parachuters, I'm going to take a piece of string and just tie it into a loop. Then I'll put the loop around my parachuter and hook one end through another to make a harness like this. So on my dinosaur, I'll put the loop around and hook one end through the other. There's my dinosaur harness. For my humans, the harness will go pretty much the same way. It'll go around under her armpits. Now my human jumper is ready to parachute. Nobody's here with me today except my dog Tucker, so I'm going to have to do this by myself. But it would be very fun to do this with other members of my family, and we could do it all at the same time and see how the different parachutes did. Here's one parachute. Got a little army guy on it. Here we go. Oh my goodness, look at it go! That was great! Here's our little girl parachuter. Here we go. Whee! There she went. So that's the end of the parachute video, unless you're interested in making a little more of a science experiment out of it, maybe even doing a science fair project. If you are interested in that, keep watching. So when we do a science project, we usually are trying to answer a question, and often the question is, how does something affect something else? And if you want to use fancy words, we call the something that's doing the affecting the independent variable, and the thing that gets affected, the dependent variable. The way to remember that is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. With a parachute, probably your dependent variable, the thing you're going to be measuring, is how well it parachutes, or maybe how long it takes to fall a certain distance. Well, what would the independent variable be? What are some things you could change in making your parachutes that might affect how long they float? Think about it. I've got some ideas too. You could try changing the type of plastic, the type of string, the length of the strings, the number of strings, the weight of the parachuter, the shape of the parachute, the size of the parachute, or a bunch of other different things you could think of. Once you decided which independent variable you wanted to change, you'd have to be careful to only change that one thing. Because if you changed more than one thing, you wouldn't know whether your parachute fell faster or slower because of the length of the string or because of the number of strings. You have to only test one thing. So let's say you decided to test the shape of the parachute. You'd have to keep the same kind of plastic, the same length of string, the same kind of string, the same number of strings, the same size of parachute. Everything would have to stay the same except for the shape. Keeping all those variables the same is called controlling your variables, because you're only changing one thing and everything else is under control. Now, if you were going to do this experiment and you wanted to just change the shape of the parachute, it's actually not that easy because there's a lot of math involved, especially if you're going to do a circular parachute. You might want to ask somebody for some help with the math part. You could even call me at the library and I'd be happy to help you with it. But I hope you've got a good start to thinking about maybe doing a science experiment with parachutes. But you know, it's really kind of all the same steps no matter what kind of experiment you're doing. You're going to think about how does one thing, the independent variable, affect something else, the dependent variable, and what are all the other things you need to keep under control to make sure that you know what your results mean. I hope you have fun playing with your parachutes and maybe doing a little bit of science too.